The Agniveer scheme marks a paradigm shift in the Indian Armed Forces recruitment patterns, intake patterns, and in fact in the army it creates a total change in the tried and tested regimental system. This is an across the board and sweeping change, and it comes at a time when our national threats are very high, and to that extent organizational turbulence, complete churn in the organization at this time may not be very desirable. Its effects will have to be mitigated. The initial response to this scheme by the general public was rather distressing. We had recruits who had done some of the basic tests and had not been taken, who were now eliminated because of this scheme age-wise. They went on the rampage, burning trains, burning cars, buses, etc., creating arson and mayhem. And that was tragic and that was surprising, because what you need in the armed forces is discipline. And quite obviously, we could not countenance the intake of people who go berserk like this. I mean, that would be dangerous to harm them. All those people who were misguided into doing this by whatever elements have done themselves great harm, because they have blocked their avenues and promotions of entry into the armed forces. Now, that having been said, thank God all that has now subsided. The problem seemed to be over, and it is now time to take a very rational, very objective look at this scheme, analyze its pros and cons, and try and make some constructive suggestions about how it could be improved, how it could be tweaked. First of all, why the Agniveers? Let me be candid and honest. The requirements are twofold as stated by the authors of the scheme. One is to reduce the age profile of the armed forces. Today we are being told the average age is around 32 plus and more in the armed forces. Quite obviously, that has a deleterious impact upon operational efficiency, especially in areas of high altitude like Ladakh, where every year extra counts and deteriorates your physical performance, your ability to stand up to those stress and rigors. So it was essential to bring down the age of the armed forces. The even more compelling reason, which is not generally stated, is the fact that out of a 2 lakh crore budget, or a $5.2 trillion budget, 1.16 trillion was being spent on pensions alone. The pensions bill had overtaken the salary bill of the serving armed forces. That meant there was a huge increase in the revenue budget with a concomitant reduction of the capital budget which you need to acquire arms. This has been causing great worry. Please don't forget, air power is a war winning factor. It has been so since the Second World War. Now we need an air force of 45 squadrons to deal with a two-front threat. What we have on the ground today is 30 squadrons and less. So how are we going to increase these balanced squadrons unless we have a substantial hike in the revenue budget? Now the simple fact is that our air force today is down to 30 squadrons, especially because of the big series of aircraft, the MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-27 being phased out, and replacements are yet to flow in terms of the LCA. We just got 36 Rafales, whereas our requirement was 115. We are still bidding for that multi-role aircraft, etc., which could take years and years. What you need is an urgent, immediate transfusion of money into your capital budget so that you can fill up the glaring gaps that are there. Mediumization of the artillery had been thought of when I was director MO5 way back in the time of the Kargil war, before the Kargil war. It still hasn't been done. So we need to add 155mm howitzers to the army. We need perhaps one more aircraft carrier. Where is this going to come from if we spend most of our budget, the bulk of our budget, on revenue allocations of pays, pensions, etc. So these were the rationales for the scheme. Now the point at issue is the following. They have now decided to lower the age of the army. By the recruitment age has gone up to 17.5 years, you will start, until 21 years. Now we are going to recruit 46,000 Agniveers in the first tranche. The first question that comes is, from the mathematics of it, that every year 60,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen retire and go into the civvy street. Now these 60,000 soldiers, over the last 2 years, there has been no recruitment. There has been no recruitment whatsoever. So the shortfall is 1,20,000 plus you add 30,000. Half this year is over. About 1,50,000 to 1,60,000 is the shortfall which has occurred due to non-recruitment in the COVID period. This has virtually cut the army by 1.5 lakhs. You see, the first problem that we have is that, the army today is short of 1.5 to 1.6 lakh soldiers, because over the last 2 years of COVID, no recruitment was done on the basis of COVID. Recruitment continued in the paramilitary forces, in the army and the navy, but somehow for the army it was stopped because of the reasons of COVID, proximity, etc., etc. And therefore 60,000 soldiers every year, soldiers, sailors and airmen, retire and they go into the civvy street. Now over 2 years, that means 1,20,000, and if you add 30,000 of this year, it means 1.5 to 1.6 lakh soldiers are short. We are going to recruit 46,000. We are being told that that is because it is virtually a kind of a trial run which is being done with this 46,000, and it will be enhanced subsequently. That means the shortage in the armed forces will continue for at least about 3 to 4 to 5 years before we are able to fill it up. We are being told that subsequently they will accelerate the intake of Agniveers, but for now this shortage is going to persist. Given the fact that we have the threat of China in Ladakh and Arunachal and elsewhere, we have the threat of Pakistan in J&K and elsewhere, we need mountains eat up manpower, and we need the manpower, especially if you have to fight in the mountains, especially if you have to do CICT operations, you need manpower. You cannot afford to cut manpower. And the prime example is what has happened right now in the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia is demographically very constrained. They have a declining population. Average age is 40 years plus, and the birth to death ratio, the death rate increases the birth rate. So therefore it is a declining population, and they have severe demographic constraints. With these demographic constraints, Russia has attacked Ukraine with an army of 1.5 lakhs, 1,50,000. The Ukrainians, because they have mobilized, because they have called up their reserves and their territorial army, are at 2.5 lakhs. And the strain is beginning to tell on the Russian army. Please bear in mind, the Russian army is not, repeat, not short of equipment in any possible way. It's not short of equipment. They are short of manpower. And the ill effects of the shortage of manpower were reflected in their failure to capture Kyiv, failure to capture Kharkiv, and now, though they are getting the they have gotten the upper hand in the Donbass province. They have taken Sverdlovsk, they are taking Lysychansk because of sheer firepower. They are having problems in Kherson, they are having had to vacate the Snake Island, etc. So the lack of manpower is a telling constraint on operational effectiveness, and no amount of equipment can make up if you don't have trained manpower, motivated manpower to handle them. Short-term inductees in the Ukraine war have performed badly. Russian conscripts, Putin wanted them out, but they had to be used because they were short of manpower, and they are being the weakest chain in the link. They have not performed optimally. So with this, when we see this happening in front of our eyes, I think it is wise to take a second look. It is wise to check your bearings once again. We cannot afford to reduce manpower. We can't afford to tinker around with that. And here I'd like to give you a bit of history, recent history. Before the Kargil war, we had major budgetary constraints in the armed forces. And that is the time the Indian economy had almost collapsed, as you all know, and then we started the economic liberalization. So in the decade of the 90s, we were told, hang on, hold on, once the GDP comes up, we'll give you the money. So in the meantime, we had glaring shortfalls. Our Soviet era equipment was being phased out of service, and we had no money to buy new equipment. So therefore, at that stage, General Malik, the then army chief, had decided that we would suppress manpower, reduce our revenue budget, transfer that to the capital budget, and continue with the military modernization. As part of that process, an exercise was done to identify 50,000 manpower to be suppressed, and as part of that, 6 pioneer companies, the Mule MA companies, Mule GS companies, which supply water, ration, ammunition, food, etc. to the troops in the high altitude posts, 16, 17, 18,000 feet and more. I mean, they were disbanded. I was director MO5, I was dealing with planning, so I have personally seen this happen before my eyes. And I had just come down from Kargil. My unit had suffered 6 killed, 21 wounded, and each of them who had to be brought down had to be, 18 men were required to bring one man down. 18 soldiers were required to bring one soldier down, because to carry a man on a stretcher it takes 6 men, 3 relays from 18,000 to 7,000 feet where the helipad was to the battalion headquarters from where he could be evacuated, meant 18 men out of the post for about 20 hours and more. So that could be done because if there was a no war, no peace situation. But if there is a shooting war on and a platoon has just about 28 to 30 men, how can you send 18 men down to carry? My objections were overruled. We continued with this, this manpower cutting process. Fortunately for us, the Kargil war started. The chief himself, that is General Malik, went forward to where the battles were taking place. He went to Tololing, and then he found lines of the wounded groaning in pain and agony. And he was furious. He said, why aren't they being evacuated? They said, sir, there is nobody to evacuate them. The pioneers have been disbanded. They are the guys who used to get them down. They have been disbanded. The MA Mule, the Mule GS companies are being disbanded. So he rushed back. Due credit to him, self-correction. He straight away ordered the disbandments to be cancelled. At the end of that war, Kargil war, we were forced, because of manpower constraints, J&K terrorism was at its peak, and the peace field profile of the infantry was in tatters. Units that served 3 years in Nagaland and Manipur, they came to peace stations like Kalimpong, peace stations like Yol Dharamshala, and they had straight away to be sent to J&K to quell the revolt there. So as a result of it, some officers, JCO's men, for 6 years, they were away from their families. And when an officer went home, his own son called him uncle, because he had hardly seen him. We were under terrible, constraints at that time, manpower constraints. Even this 1.3 million army was proving to be too less. we were forced to raise 36 additional battalions of the Rashtriya Rifles. 36 additional battalions of the Rashtriya Rifles, 6 sector headquarters, 4 force headquarters had to be raised at a time when we were trying to cut down manpower. Instead of cutting down manpower, the ground realities forced us to enhance manpower. So as a military professional, my first advice is, at this time, with the threat from China and Pakistan extant, with Taliban in Afghanistan, I do not think we can afford to cut manpower. And whatever manpower cuts have come in due to COVID now need to be speedily filled up. The second objection that people have is that one is happy to hear that the central government is making monumental efforts to try and find avenues of re-employment for the Agniveers who will come in for 4 years. The CPOs say they will reserve 10%, the Ministry of Defence 10%, etc. They are going to the private sector who have also offered to take them in, but there are grey areas. The simple fact is that one of the most logical manpower management schemes would have been to have a young profile in the armed forces and then send them to the paramilitary forces where they would be trained to fight the Naxals, trained to take on any of the CICT contingencies that have to be faced by the paramilitary forces, the CPOs, the Assam Rifle, etc. They would be trained, they would be absolutely combat hardened and would be a useful value addition to the CPOs. But it was never done. If you see the data put out by the Directorate General of Resettlement of the Army, in grade C posts, they had the percentage of people recruited, those who had retired in group C was 0.9% and in group D was 0.47%. That means total of 1.37% of the retiring personnel only were absorbed into the CPOs, and that was because of the turf wars. Even today the chief of the CRPF has said, why should I accept rejects from the army? The Agniveers will be rejects from the army. So there are those grey areas. The point that I am trying to make is the army was one of the most attractive careers in the rural hinterland. One of the best careers that they could join. It gave you a lot of status, it gave you good pay, it gave you long years of service, and then it gave you a pension for life. So therefore it was a very sought after profession. Therefore we got some of the best physical specimens from the villages, from the countryside. We need the sportsmen, the athletes, the physically fit, the wrestlers, boxers, etc. for the armed forces. Today, when you reduce the age of the Agniveer, the service period of the Agniveer, to just 4 years, I am afraid it is not a viable career. If I, as a young man today, have to choose between the army and the CRPF, CISF, BSF, where once I join, I serve for life till 58 years. That is the retiring age in the CPOs. Would I choose a job where after 4 years I am on the streets? What about the attractiveness of the military as a career? It has to be a viable career. So instead of carping, I have a practical suggestion to make. When I joined the army, that was at the time of the 71 war, we took part in that 71 war, we were part of that liberation of Bangladesh. The color service of the Jawans was just 7 years. Why? To keep the army young. And we had a very young army. We had joined at 1921, we were second lieutenants fighting. Arun Khetrapal laid down his life at 21 years of age, he was a Paramveer Chakra posthumous. So the fact of the matter is that we had a very young profile. My CO was just 32 years of age when he was commanding officer, when we took part in that campaign. So we had a very young profile. Why? Because we were retiring soldiers at 7 years of color service and he went back. 7 years is a tried and tested model. Please listen carefully. 7 years is a tried and tested model. It has given you the victory of the 1971 war, unparalleled military victory. So why don't we revert to 7 years? That gives a viable tenure. Let me tell you what is the problem with 4 years. 4 years, 6 months training. They have reduced annual leave from 2 months to 1 month. Now that itself has certain constraints. A boy serving in the glacier, a boy serving in CICT ops requires that 2 months, because the combat stress then starts getting higher and higher. And to avoid untoward incidents, we used to have a principle in the Rationale rifle. I've had 2 tenures there, that after every 3 months, 90 days, these are statistical figures that the combat stress rises. So these are statistical figures. After every 90 days, we used to send him home on either casual leave or annual leave, have a break, come back, recharge, fight again. So today you are reducing it to 1 month for the Agniveers. As it is, the Agniveer is going to be under a fair amount of tension because he wants to be retained, he will be fighting. That itself could be detrimental. This level of competition could be detrimental to cohesive integration with the unit. So in any case, let's say we just go in for 1 month annual leave, and you give him the opportunity also to encash that annual leave. So if he wants to serve 4 years continuously, he is most welcome to do that. His operational efficacy without any leave for 4 years, I have my doubts. I have been in operations throughout my life, and I have my reservation. So out of 4 years, let us say you give him just 1 month of annual leave, there's still three years of annual leave gone. 3 months of annual leave gone, plus casual leave, plus some courses. He will be available to the unit practically in effect only for 2.5, maximum close to 3 years, which is little, it's too little for him to integrate with the unit, imbibe its ethos, its traditions, gel in the team, especially for crew served weapons, armored corps, artillery. These are all crew served weapons where you have to be part of a crew, and the weakest link in the chain is the strength of the chain. There is a doubt as to how, if a boy has to come back after 4 years without pension, how willing would he be to take risk and get killed or get wounded badly, because that would hamper his chances of re-employment. You could have these people becoming risk averse. You could have an unhealthy level of competition, because if 75% of the Agniveers are to go home after 4 years, the level of competition in the unit would be unhealthy. Number one. Number two, the management problem of the commanding officer. The buck stops with the commanding officer. He has to manage this kind of a thing. He is operationally deployed. He is in Siachen. He is in Kargil. He is in Ladakh. So will he train the new inductees, or will he focus on the operational role? Which role would you want him to stress? We are creating problems at the working level. So the humble submission is that to make it a viable career per se, everybody is focused on the second career. I am saying, what about the first career? What about his operational efficacy? What value does he bring to his unit? If he just serves for 4 years, he is trained, he is, serves maximum 2.5 years with the unit and is out. He can't integrate, he can't be made part, he can't imbibe that ethos, and by the time he has learnt, he is trained, he is going out. 17 years is what a present Jawan serves. In a 17-year time period, you will have to have minimum 4 to 5 Agniveers whom you will have to train, induct and de-induct. So this 4 years is a problem. 25% induction is definitely a problem that needs to be looked at by the authors of this very, very profound, path-breaking, paradigm shift kind of a change. My suggestion, constructive suggestion is, please increase the age to 7 years. Tried and tested method. He may be a little older than for the second career, but we can't give primacy to the second career right now at the cost of the first career, at the cost of the armed forces, their viability, their attractiveness as a career. As it is, it was the lowest choice for officers because of the tough life. The officers, thank God, we haven't tinkered with that as yet. We had the short service scheme, which was supposed to be a support cadre. Today you have made the entire armed forces into short service. So that has its consequences in terms of management problems, management of the change problems, management of the ethos model, etc. So the issue is that there are too many changes coming in together. You are reduced the army by 1.5 lakhs, big change. It has an impact at the ground level. Units almost get one company short. Can you imagine the impact of that in a battle? Your reserve company is gone. So then comes that 4-year period, 2 less. Then the retention of just 25%, 2 less, creates unhealthy competition, militates against experience. You have to have a balance of youth and experience. And especially for crew served weapon, where that boy has to gel with the crew. Imagine a crew of 3 or 4, and every 2-3 years there is a new member coming in that crew. That crew doesn't integrate, he can't fight together. Therefore you have these management problems. And what about the hidden cost of training? When you train, well, the cost is to the establishment. For one recruit of today, you are going to have to train 4 to 5 Agniveers in that same period. Fine, you will not pay pension, you might save money. Even that money will not be available now. That money comes to you, of course that saving comes, and it's a rational saving, but it comes almost 10-15 years down the line. You still have to find the resources. You still have to find the resources to buy the new equipment that is sorely, badly needed. There is no denying that fact. You need equipment. So what is the alternative solution? One being suggested is that our defense budget, which was 2.8% of the GDP in 2012, is today down to 2.1% of the GDP. In Rajiv Gandhi's time, it was reached the highest of almost about 4.2% of the GDP. That is what this country can afford to spend. And we were economically quite okay at that time, but this is what this country can afford to spend, 4.2%. We were forced to spend around that when the 62 war came. So why do we want to be pushed by a bad performance in war to find the resources to re-equip ourselves? Because the Agniveer scheme, please understand, in the immediate term is not going to give you the financial payoffs. That they are only trying to do by cutting manpower, and I said the deleterious effects of cutting manpower can be quite painful on the battlefield. Painful on the battlefield, especially if we have to fight in the mountains. As I said, the mountains eat up troops, CICT ops eat up troops. The line of control, when a CO has to spend 100 to 150 ambushes out every night to stop infiltration on the line of control, I mean that manpower management, leave management, etc. become a huge problem. Change is a good thing. Change is the law of life. Nothing can remain static forever. The fact, however, is that armed forces are very change-averse organizations. As somebody said, it is, as B.H. Littlehart said, it is the only thing more difficult than getting a new idea into the military mind is taking an old idea out. To that extent, armed forces, especially the army, is traditional. They are change averse, and it is very difficult. You really have to manage change if you want to introduce it. So the point is that change management is the key. I am afraid in the execution of this scheme, We have, in change management, we have faltered because we were not adequately able to, prepare the environment for the degree of seismic change that we were planning to introduce. There could have been longer open discussions because yes, it was discussed for 2 years. The previous Chief of Defence Staff was working on it, his staff was working on it. The Naval Chief said he has been working on it for 2 years. So the fact of the matter is that it was being discussed closed doors. At a point in time, you have to go public with this scheme, you have to go to the people. And I'm afraid, let's be honest about it, let's face facts. In that management of change, we have faltered because the kind of riots that we have seen, the kind of misperceptions that have been, allowed to go unchecked, this thing could have been handled better. And the suggestion made was that we could have introduced it as a pilot scheme. The point is against that is that if you had introduced it as a pilot scheme and you had kept the parallel recruitment process on, very few people would have come here for the pilot scheme and not gone there. So the answer has been found in trying to have a truncated 46,000 first batch of Agniveers, and I am very sure that once this goes through, it will be tried, it will be tested, the difficulties will be identified, ironed out. What my humble submission is, we are not in a position to start ironing out difficulties if we have major threats to manage. The threat in Ladakh is here and now. It is concrete. And at this stage, to have organizational turbulence of this magnitude may not have been the wisest thing to do. Now that it has been done, well, we'll have to all stand by our armed forces and see that this change is managed to the best of possibilities. And to that extent, it is essential to have a thorough debate, dispassionate debate, discussion, get more of your people who have combat experience, who have been through it all. Like I've said, I've been through these manpower cutting exercises before. Instead of cutting, we had to increase. We were forced to increase by operational circumstances. So let's not get forced by operational circumstances to change. Let us see let us apply ourselves to crystal gaze and see what problems could be and try and set them right. So the concrete suggestion that I have is increase this to 7 years color service. The major criteria cannot be that they will not be acceptable to the CPOs, because then that is giving a primacy to the CPOs, which is good, but it has its bad effects on the armed forces, your first line of defense. You see, the armed forces have to be kept a viable career option, an attractive career option to the youth in the villages, otherwise they will not come, or the better ones of them will not come to us, they will go to the others. There is so much shortage of jobs here that I can't think of why people are thinking of job cutting. To tell me that the armed forces are not a welfare organization begs the point. They still provide jobs, and you are cutting jobs when the requirement is to create more jobs. You see, 60,000 is the offtake every year. So 46,000 cannot quite obviously make it. I am sure this will have to be accelerated. Please accelerate so that you can get better. Give the Agniveer a viable chance of becoming permanent. 25 percentile is very unfavorable. That is a little too unhealthy. Minimum 50%, or at the minimum you must get it up to 40%. So that makes a viable chance of him having a stable career. That career has to be thought of, that it will do X amount of good to the civilian populace at large. Now comes the question of, look, there are already some doubts being expressed at some levels. We heard, I heard an industry panel discussion saying, look, the job that we can offer to the Agniveer coming out is of 15,000 rupees a month. He is used to 30,000 and more rupees a month. He's tasted blood. That is what exact words I am quoting of some very prominent industrialists of India. So we'll give him a job of 15,000 a month. That itself is karta kya na marta, it is not the happiest of situation. A fear has been expressed, and that fear is not groundless. I will give you historical backdrops. That fear is not groundless, that if these are not absorbed, it will be at the cost of the nation. If these people are not absorbed, it will be at the cost of the country, the nation state, because they could easily then be, attracted away by gangsters, by terrorist organizations and the like, by Naxals if they are in Bihar and Jharkhand. You see, the simple fact of the matter is, I am told that this just can't happen. If you have become disciplined in 4 years, well then you will not do such things. Perhaps, yes. But let me tell you what exactly happened. I lived through the terrorist phase in the Punjab. I served there from 1985 to 1987 end, at the peak, just after Operation Blue Star. Do you know the kind of worry that we had about our ex-servicemen going astray? We held ex-servicemen rallies, we held this thing, and actually a lot of these ages etc. were increased to see that they don't go out into the mainstream again, without some fallback options. And please, have you heard the name Major General Shabek Singh? He was leading the fight in the Golden Temple. Most of his force was ex-servicemen. Please do not take your eyes away ostrich-like from a possibility which, even if a fraction of them join, can be extremely dangerous. So if some people are inclined to deal with it, this is a problem we'll deal with after 4 years, then I don't think that is a very wise approach. To sum it all, increase the colour service back to 7 years. If there is such a problem in terms of resettlement, the minimum that you will have to do is about 5 to 6 years, so that there are some returns on investment on the boy that you have brought into the army. The army has a very difficult job to perform. The armed forces have an extremely difficult job to perform. If war comes, they are the country's only life insurance. So just because we haven't had a major shooting war, it can't be treated in that manner. We are being told that the paramilitary CPOs will take care of CICT ops, the army doesn't have to bother about them. Unfortunately, for the last so many years, so many decades, the armed forces have been, the army has been involved in CICT operations in a very, very major way. Even now, it's being involved in J&K thoroughly, it's involved in the northeast. So that argument that the CICT operations can all now be offloaded to the CPOs, who are the only people who need to be trained to fight, the army is not there for parades. When the shit starts flying, when something breaks out which is big, I mean, you will need soldiers who are well trained, well motivated, and who are up to the job, who are well integrated into cohesive units. The army, the armed forces are critical to national security. Just because there hasn't been a war for some years, you can't rely on the hope that we will be able to get away with diluting the combat potential of the armed forces. You can't afford it. To say that our diplomats will prevent wars with China, they will not let a two-front war happen. Kudos to our diplomats. I wish them the best. But you have to plan for worst case scenarios. You can't say then, oh, our diplomats failed us, so we are not ready for a two-front war. You have to be ready for a two-front war. I am reading articles in the newspaper to the effect that, oh, a two-front war is a chimera, it will never happen. Our diplomats are so good, they will make sure that we don't fight with the two of them together. Excellent. That is what they are supposed to do. But you are supposed to have the armed forces as an insurance. When everything fails, you have the armed forces. They were one of the most respected institutions in this country, they still are. Let's not dilute that armed forces as a career option, armed forces as a way of life. Give him that minimal span, of 7 years. If you can't do 7 years, 5 to 6, but 4 is not workable. You will find it out. Don't wait to find it out. It's not workable. It's not viable. From my operational experience, I'm telling you that. That's my humble advice. It can be crumpled into a ball and thrown into the waste paper basket, but do listen to the people who have operational experience. They are only trying to help. They are only trying to help. It's our job to help the boys who have to carry the can now. My days of war fighting are over. I fought in 1971. We took part in 71. I fought in the Punjab. I fought in Kargil, Kishtwar, Rajouri, Punch. And from whatever combat experience I have, these are the inputs that I am trying to provide to the decision maker. Apropos the fact of your regimental system being tampered with, because what is now happens is that the bulk of the motivation practical on ground in the Indian Army is based upon the ethos of the regiment, regimental spirit, regimental flag, lanyard, Gideon, regimental history, battalion history, etc. So these are corporate institutions that have been around for 250 years. They have performed well in World War I, World War II. They did well in all the wars after independence, less 62 when there was political interference. It was not really the armed forces' fault. It was political interference of the highest order. So the fact of the matter is, if something ain't broken, don't fix it. Well, we have a problem of reducing age profiles. We have a problem of how to get the money. I'm sure that can be managed, because you will still have to get the money with this scheme in place, because the financial benefits of this scheme will come only 10-15 years later when they had to retire and go into service. Manpower cutting is not the way to it, because it has been tried earlier and I have told you the results of what happened then. So if you want to repeat history, we will go into it. There will be, let's not get pushed into change. Let us drive change. Let us drive change. Let us foresee what could happen and react, anticipate that change and act before that. So increase the age profile to 7 years, 40 to 50% retention maximum. Cost cutting should not be the primary factor. Operational effectiveness is also a major concern of the Republic that cannot be lost sight of. If what we are seeing happen in Ukraine is any guide to go by, the need for military manpower, motivated, well-trained military manpower is essential. If you are doing away with the regimental system, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose did away with that regimental system, and yet the INA performed very well because they switched to a militant nationalism model of motivation. So before you shift to the regimental system, it's already being done, but I think that will need to be enhanced. Nationalism as the major motivating credo, nation level nationalism, that will have to be intensified if we want to transit from the present system, regimental ethos of Naam, Namak, Nishan, Izzat of the Paltan, Izzat of the regiment, etc., Izzat of that family tradition going into one regiment. All that will change, but fine, it did. Even without this, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose mixed up all the regiments and they fought. Out of 60,000, 26,000 laid down their lives. That meant attrition rate of almost 42%. They bore that, they withstood, they retained combat cohesion, the units of the INA, till the very end of that war. Despite defeat, retreat, withdrawal, most difficult operations to conduct, they did very well. So we can learn from that INA model and start introducing it now. Start introducing it now so that you are ready for the change that comes in. Change has to be managed. Change has to be put through in a manner that does not create organizational turbulence of an order that can be deleterious to operational efficiency and performance. That's all that we are saying. We must change. Change is the law of life, but you have to manage that change. You have to foresee the consequences of the change. You have to time that change. Maximum organizational turbulence cannot be accepted at a time of maximum threats. So, we have to make haste slowly to see that this experiment succeeds. Traditionally, the Indian armed forces have relied not on conscription. We have never had a conscript army. India has always had a tradition of all volunteer army, because there are so many poor jobless people in this country. We fielded an army of 1.1 million in World War I. We fielded an army of 2.5 million all volunteer force in World War II. This is not conscription, yes, but this is short term entry, which has not been the case earlier. You are doing a major transition to say that Israel has done it or America has done it. Well, they have a totally different context. And by the way, the Indian armed forces were held up as a model by others, by foreigners. So for you to say, oh, we haven't done well, let us learn from Israel, let us learn from the United States, I am afraid they also have a lot to learn from us, because we have done well in all the wars that we have fought, especially 71, and we have seen the latest performance in Kargil and CICT ops. I don't think we have done too badly. So, other armed forces have to learn from the Indian armed forces. We are not such a useless organization that which has suffered a major defeat and has to be overhauled because it was not fighting, it was not doing its job. They were doing a damn fine job, the most respected thing in the country. Yes, they still have to get to a younger age profile. They still have to generate enough finances to be able to ensure their military modernization, but not at the cost of operational efficiency. That is all my this thing, and I again summarize the changes that can be done to this path breaking scheme, that paradigm shift scheme. 7 years color service, restore that, you will have a viable tenure. If you can't do 7, at least get it down to 5 or 6, because that is the minimum that you need to integrate. That is combat tested, combat proven, has done well. 7 years has given you excellent results on the battlefield, and 50% retention is what I would advise. If there are such major economic constraints that the country just can't afford to pay for its armed forces, well then go to 40%, but make it a viable chance. Don't make it such a rat race which you are leaving to the commanding officer to manage. Will he now write ACRs on all his Jawans because they have to be retained? All the Agniveers, he is already writing ACRs down to NCO level. What will be that process? There will be accusations galore. Anybody who is out of the army, who has lost out on a permanent job, will not be a very happy individual. And we know the kind of accusations that start flying, that so and so was so and so's Batman, etc., and not me. Why me? Why not him? Why not me? Or, I mean, visualize these problems. Is the task of the commanding officer, he is the cutting edge. So there is a lot of good in this scheme. Let us retain the good, but let us deal with those aspects that could endanger operational efficiency, and there certainly are a number of these features. I think what it calls for is rational debate. What it calls for is discussion in-house and now public, because the more public it is, the better it will be, because it will help manage the change at the level of the recipient. If he feels helpless, if all change is just enforced from the top without involving the participant at some stage, well, it can have its ill consequences or deleterious consequences. I am very sure this scheme will be tweaked. I am very sure with experience the scheme will be fine-tuned, and I wish the armed forces the very best. It is now the 3 service chiefs who have to carry the can. They are now responsible. We can only advise, we can only suggest, we can only voice our apprehensions so that they can be taken care of, and a culture of candor prevails in the armed forces. We had a culture in my time of speak your mind freely. Don't hold back. When you are asked to do a staff analysis, you are not asked to bootlick. You are asked to put your cogent, firm views. So help us God, I may be wrong, but in the little light that the Lord gave me to see, I am trying to help. I am trying to help and put forth suggestions so that this scheme, this path breaking scheme can be fine tuned, can be ironed out and made perfect. Jai Hind.